Welcome back to the Shoebill Studio. I'm Steve, and today we're going to be reviewing Spellrift Legends, which is Dragori Games' new cooperative adventure game that launches on Gamefound on September 16, 2025. If the name Dragori sounds familiar, it's probably because of Arena the Contest and Tenaris Adventures, as well as the many expansions that belong to those games as well. And those projects built Dragori a reputation for ambitious, content-driven designs with a strong emphasis on production quality. They also successfully crowdfunded Odalin Dungeons of Doom, which is currently in its printing and shipping phase of fulfillment. But today's video is about their latest creation, which is Spellrift Legends, and I've had the chance to try it out early. Dragori Games reached out to me a few weeks ago and sent me this prototype for review, and this is an unpaid review. There have been no contracts signed, no money has exchanged hands, no promises have been made. They just shipped me this prototype and asked me to share my thoughts, good, bad, or otherwise. And it really is a prototype. It doesn't include everything that the core set has to offer. There are no miniatures, not all of the heroes are present. I've only got Bernhild the Valkyrie, Hercules, and Miyamoto Musashi. Not all of the monsters are here. And I've only got a single boss, the Eye of Nothingness. So my impressions are based on this incomplete, sort of prototypical version of the game, and I can't comment on what the final component quality is going to be, as many of these pieces are actually just placeholders for those pieces. Dragori does have a strong history with miniatures and production values, so I would assume that all of those things will be in order and alignment with the games they've produced in the past. And just to be clear, Dragori's previous games are all well received and definitely well loved by their fan base. Since this is the Shoebill's first review of a game actively being crowdfunded, let's set some expectations. Now, I'm certainly no stranger to crowdfunding. I've definitely participated in my fair share of campaigns. You've seen some of the products that I've purchased in the past, but it's important to remember that backing a game on Gamefound or on Kickstarter is definitely not the same as retail. You're pledging money to support the development of this product, and that means that things can change, timelines can slip, and final content may be different from what's shown here in this video or even in the campaign itself. Dragori Games is advertising a 5-month guarantee for this campaign, meaning that if they miss their delivery estimate by more than 5 months, you can request a 100% refund. So there is that. There's not endless waiting on Star Citizen here. You're not going to be in that situation. But before we go any further, I feel like it's important that I just let you know up front that I've had a lot of fun with Spellrift Legends so far, both thematically and also mechanically. But that doesn't mean that you should just back it blindly. So let's dive in a little bit deeper and peel back the layers on this very layered game. Before we get to the actual gameplay itself, it's important that we address some of the comparisons and sort of like marketing claims that are being made about Spellrift Legends, both by Dragori but also just like people in the community. And Dragori markets this is verbatim from their marketing materials. They market this as an open world adventure game with Slay the Spire inspired deck building. And the Slay the Spire part is, I think, the thing that I want to address first, and it's really only half true. And part of that is just semantics, right? Like, by comparing a game to Slay the Spire, we're sort of not really drawing a line in the sand as far as where does that comparison start and where does it end. And there are some very obvious things that this game shares with Slay the Spire. For instance, when you upgrade your deck, you draw 3 and you pick 1, which is a very typical and sort of common roguelike drafting mechanic that's present in Slay the Spire and many, many other games. And the combat is similar in the sense that when you enter in combat, it's sort of like, 2 enter, 1 leave. You go until one side loses. But also combat is similar to Slay the Spire, the board game, in the fact that you use a d6 to determine enemy intent. You roll that at the beginning of each combat phase, and it tells you some perfect information about what your enemy will be doing. But that is essentially where it ends. Slay the Spire is sort of a once-in-a-generation experience, in my opinion. That game is insanely good, and to compare yourself to it is, I think, a very difficult thing to do because it sets people's expectations very, very high. I myself have probably pushing 4,000 hours of playtime in the video game. I'm not ashamed. I love pushing Ascension 20 with characters, and I still haven't mastered the defect after all of these years. It is easily one of my favorite games, and I feel very comfortable saying that this game is not Slay the Spire. And that's actually a really good thing. Honestly, it's closer to a Gloomhaven Slay the Spire sort of hybrid, with a simplified version of Gloomhaven's initiative system that presents as biphasic combat split between ranged and melee attacks. So you get all of the enjoyment of a fairly streamlined, elegant combat system, but you also get some of the more grokky, crunchy sequencing stuff that you have to be aware of to really, make you feel clever when you get a particular combo or attack to pop off. So not Slay the Spire, but its own thing, and in a really good way. The next claim that we're going to address is this open world claim, and open world is such a problematic phrase for games, both video games and board games. I don't really think that open world applies to that many board games, and so the use of it here is really just sort of board game language, in my opinion, for there's a map and you can move around on the map. Perhaps the open worldness will sort of blossom and come into its own thing once the campaign additions are added to this game, and going to a specific location ends up yielding a unique experience. For me, open world essentially means like you see the mountain in the distance, you can go there and experience everything between the point that you stand at and the mountain itself. But they definitely are not wrong about the adventure side of this game. It's very much intact, lots of adventures to be had here that are quite enjoyable, but don't expect video game style sort of open world sandbox to explore and learn about. At least not in the core box, like I mentioned. The interactions in the core box just are not that deep. And the final comparison that I've seen, which is not necessarily in the main tagline that they're using to market this game, is a comparison to Eldritch Horror. Eldritch Horror, not like the theme or the genre, but Eldritch Horror, literally the board game. And that is accurate. The exploration, map management, and sort of like the threat management, timer management part of this game is very, very similar to Eldritch Horror. You're traveling the map, dealing with stuff at these different locations, like I said, managing timers and like a doom tracker. And so if you really love Eldritch Horror, that DNA is very strong here in this game. It's very clearly inspired by those systems. It also means that there is a ton of accounting to do. I would say that probably the thing that people criticize about Eldritch Horror the most is just how many systems you're managing once that game gets up and running. So yes, the marketing taglines are directionally true, but the actual experience really is its own hybrid of all of these things that we've mentioned. And again, I want to reiterate, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And so let's talk a little bit about the core gameplay sort of loop of an entire game of Spellrift. At its core, the point of Spellrift Legends is pretty simple. You need to interact with a bunch of stuff on the board and manage a bunch of stuff on the board that will ultimately allow you to summon the boss, and then you need to take a shot at trying to defeat that boss. And if you defeat it, well, you win, and if you fail to manage the different things, or if you can't defeat the boss, well, you lose. And to get there, you'll spend most of your time sort of exploring the board. Maybe you'll be completing quests with certain characters or closing void rifts, which are the things that allow the monsters to be spawned onto the map in the first place. And you'll also be leveling up your hero through, collecting XP doing all of these interactions so that you can spend that XP on deck upgrades from these large, customized, unique decks that are unique to each of the heroes that come with this game. And then hopefully by the end of all of that, you'll be both individually and as a team strong enough to take on the final boss. And there are definitely a lot of ways to lose here. Like I mentioned, there's a doom tracker here that if you can't manage the creatures on the board, the doom will go up. If your entire team dies at once, you'll lose. Additionally, the way that the boss works is there's a little sort of boss deck of 9 cards. It's actually very similar to Aeon's End in this way, that it sort of like progressively gets more difficult as you go. But when that boss deck runs out, you also will lose. But again, there's only really one way to win, and that's if you trigger the boss's unique summoning condition and then you survive long enough to take it out. So how does a typical round play? Well, a typical round is 3 phases, and the first is a journey phase. You're drawing cards, you're gaining resources, but most interestingly, in my opinion, is you get to use the utility portion of the cards in your hand. And the utility portion of your card is actually at the bottom of the card, and we'll go into greater detail about the cards and all of the uses because it's by and far one of my favorite parts of this game. The utility system allows you to buff your character with what are called exploits, which are more or less persistent buffs that you cast on your character during your preparation phase, but also you get the option for instant casts. It gets you really thinking critically about weighing your options between using this card for combat that you might enter into later this turn, or maybe you need it for that instant effect so that you can get an immediate resolution to a problem that's on the board state right this second. I've really enjoyed the tension that it creates where I'm really having to ask myself, do I want to spend this right now? I might need it a little bit later in a different phase of this round. Which leads us to the second phase, the exploration phase. And this is where you're interacting with your position on the board. You're exploring regions, you're attempting to complete quests, maybe you're closing void rifts so that monsters can't spawn in that zone. This is also when you might engage in a rest action to recuperate from some nasty effects that you've experienced, maybe from battle or otherwise. And definitely this is also where you would be engaging monsters on your space in combat. And we'll talk about combat sort of as a breakout section a little bit later. And successful engagements yield many different types of rewards, whether it's XP or maybe a favor from a zone that you've been able to successfully explore in. That'll give you all sorts of different things. Maybe you're going to be picking up some awesome new equipment from the item deck, or maybe a new buff. But you need to be careful about not overextending, because failure at any of these engagements also comes with a cost. Oftentimes you get a little bit of XP even when you fail, but usually you're going to be engaging with the debuff system, which is another sort of layer of things that kind of affect all of the other systems in this game by increasing or decreasing your dice rolls when you're doing skill checks or even in some combat situations. And then we have the third and final phase, which is the boss phase. And in this phase, you draw a card from this boss deck and you execute its instructions. It's very similar to Cthulhu Death May Die or Eldritch Horror in this regard, which is, sort of similar to the Mythos phase. This will have you opening new void rifts for new monsters to spill into the world, and it might be spreading negative environmental effects across the board in the form of despair, which makes it so that it's hard to travel through zones. You have to spend more resource to move in those spaces. But each boss card also has a special unique effect that is, specific to the boss that you're fighting, and also specific to the card that it's on. And some of them will require you to pass a skill check, but more interestingly, some will actually introduce secondary goals that you'll need to resolve, otherwise you'll have like a persistent negative effect. But what's important and what I want you to know about the rounds is the actual feel. Like, what does it feel? What does the core gameplay loop feel like? And honestly, this game moves pretty quickly once you know the rules, but that's the trick, is getting to the point where you're comfortable enough with the rules that you can navigate all of the systems at once, fluidly and quickly. There's always pressure from the Doom tracker, like I mentioned, or the boss deck running out. And the whole game really builds toward, you timing your upgrade power curve with summoning the boss before these timers, time you out, and then ultimately, you get a chance to defeat them in combat. So let's talk about what I think works really well in Spellrift Legends. And at the top of the list, I'm going to put combat. It's just fun. It's strategic without being overly complicated, and it's satisfying in a way that makes you want more of it. You get done with one combat sort of session and you're looking for your next fight. And this biphasic system that I mentioned, where you're engaged in combat where all of the ranged combat happens and then all of the melee combat happens, adds a layer of timing and rewards you for clever sequencing, but it doesn't drag or become like ultra convoluted. Combat is still dice driven. The cards in your hand as you play them tell you how many dice you get to use, but the sequencing of the cards in combat and also the mitigation options that you can sort of spec into, they all interact, and it means that you're not just chucking dice and hoping for your best outcome. You're setting yourself up to feel clever when things go right, and that combination, which is like fast, tense, explosive moments of, oh my god, I did it, it can feel really, really rewarding. And it makes me wish that this game leaned into combat more often, instead of spending so much time during the exploration phase doing skill checks, which I think are much less exciting and certainly much less interactive. But let's really quickly give you actually like an example of what combat looks like. At the top of combat, after you've gone to a space where there are monsters for you to fight, the first thing that you'll do is you'll roll the monster dice, which are these D6s. They're not numbered 1 through 6. I think they have 2 sides that are 3 and 2 sides that are 2. But the point is that you roll these as monster intent dice, and these tell you what the monster does. So each of them can do different things. You might be fighting a group of 3 priests of oblivion, and all 3 of the priests, depending on how their dice rolled, might be attacking you a little bit differently. So again, you have to think through the sequencing and consider which one of these priests of oblivion do I need to destroy first. And of course, all creatures have melee or ranged attacks, as well as other modifiers that are indicated on the card that we won't get into. Either way, once you've rolled these intent dice, you'll put the health of these monsters out onto the health tracker, and then you will actually get to play the cards from your hand. And the top portion of every card is where the attack action is sort of detailed. And you'll get to choose the sequence that you want to put out your ranged attacks, and then the sequence that you want to put out your melee attacks. And some of the really cool things about this is that there are also persistent effects that are, sort of in brackets as combat or round. And so these are also really dependent upon how you trigger and when you trigger these, because let's say you have a round effect that is only going to be out there for this particular set of sequenced cards. You're going to want that earlier in the sequence, but maybe the attack that goes with it is actually something that you would want after a different card. So you can see where I'm getting at, there's a puzzle within a puzzle here where you're having to try to respond to how the intent dice of the monsters have rolled, and then also think through the cards that you've drawn on this turn. The next thing that I want to talk about are the multi-use cards, and this actually might be sort of the Rockstar All-Star backbone of this entire game. It is an absolutely standout system in Spellrift Legends, and obviously it's heavily inspired by games like Gloomhaven, but every card in your hand can serve like a base 3 different purposes, but actually there's even more than that. You've got the top part, which is the combat action, which we talked a little bit about in the combat breakdown, as well as the utility portion that we talked about in the journey phase. But also the bottom portion is the skill check part of the card, which for almost anything that you're doing that's not combat, you're going to be doing skill checks that are essentially assemble a dice pool, you roll the dice, and you need to match the number that's on the engagement card that you've drawn. But you can also always discard a card from your hand to buff an attack by 1 or give yourself 1 armor, and then in a skill check you can discard 2 cards to get a skill test die of any color. This flexibility really changes how you think about every draw and every draft. You're not just drafting for combat or for skill checks, you're also drafting for these utility effects. And in most deck builders, you kind of like grab the biggest, flashiest upgrade that hits the hardest or, creates the most OP combo that you can think of. But here you're really weighing whether or not you need that rare card. It's never super straightforward whether or not you just need to get the super slammer or if you want to just grab something that's specific to the utility that you're trying to accomplish. So maybe your deck is screaming for more mobility or healing or resource generation, and that really has nothing to do with the nuke that has just been drawn out of the upgrade deck. So it makes drafting a lot more interesting in my opinion, and it means that you're rarely stuck with a dead hand because you have so much stuff that you can do. And I think that this really helps keep every turn dynamic and keeps the deck building feeling like a living puzzle instead of just constantly focusing on the power curve. And I really came away impressed by how often the multi-use design forced me into tough but satisfying trade-offs. It's definitely a chance for us as players to get to build heroes that feel like they have unique archetypes, while also making each run feel just a little bit different. And that brings me to the next thing that I wanted to talk about that is really good about this core set, which is replayability. And even though this is just in a prototypical form, it's obvious that this game has legs to me. There's the small changes that are always going to happen between games, like the map tiles are randomized, and in the full version of the game, the map tiles are actually going to be double-sided, and it'll be really interesting to see how they implement that, because you might be able to see like a board state that is particularly weighted in one color and not many others. Maybe there's a board state where you don't even see a yellow tile. I have no idea. But that affects the way that you draft even more heavily. And so I really like the idea that, you might have games where certain colors are much more useful because regions are much more represented based on how you've sort of drawn the cards. They already have effects like this in the game, like for instance, the bosses are vulnerable to types of damage. The Eye of Nothingness is actually vulnerable to green type damage, and so you're incentivized to draft big hitting green attacks if you want to take down the boss that is vulnerable to green damage, which means they take double damage. But additionally, every hero has a unique deck with a ton of possible upgrades. So depending on what you draw out of this thing, every single time that you run it, it's going to feel a little bit different. And what I can say is that when I was finishing games of this, I was actually thinking about the next time I wanted to play. Whether that was immediately or, oh, I kind of want to try Hercules next. Maybe I want to try 3 hands at once. And I've definitely played this game solo, like a true solo, single-handed, and it holds up in a very enjoyable way. I don't know how balanced it is, but it was fun and it felt different every time. And I was always thinking, I kind of want to play Brynhild again, but I want to take it in a different direction. I played a mobility version of her and she was just zipping all over the map. But on the topic of solo play, I honestly think that this was how I enjoyed experiencing Spellrift Legends the most. The pacing is faster, obviously, because you're not having to wait on people interpreting your rules. You don't have to teach anyone, but the rounds just go quickly because you're also just focused solely on a particular hero that you're playing and that you have sort of a vision for the way that you want to build out their deck. The solo mode gives you twice as many actions per round. It's essentially like you took a 2-player game and you've collapsed it into the solo mode. But this also makes it so that you see more upgrades come out of your deck. And so you see that deck evolve in more meaningful ways, and the power curve for a single character gets more accentuated, and you kind of get to fall more into the character or class fantasy that you've decided to build into, which was really, really fun and enjoyable. And I hope that they can develop this game more to support that mode even further. And for players that want to play big co-op adventures, but always can't get a group, that is something that I think will really, really add a ton of value for you. Let's talk about the core box completeness. This base game feels pretty complete as far as a gameplay loop and enjoyment loop on its own. You pick a hero, you build the deck, you manage the board state, summon the boss, you take it down. The full arc is more or less intact here. You could just buy this core set and be very satisfied with the game as it is. The campaign mode probably will add a lot of systems that are enjoyable, but they will also increase the amount of bookkeeping that is required for the player. And I don't really think that you need anything else to enjoy this game as it stands. So if it's something that you enjoy just the core set here alone, all of those add-ons are just going to be a big bonus with lots of extra time to play, perhaps one of your new favorite games. What I can say about the core set is that if you're looking for deep narrative or story-driven content, this core set might not really work for you. They're trying to make it so that you go to an area and there's they briefly describe a generic event that you're resolving, but ultimately it's just a skill check. So it wasn't something that I could connect to as a player in my experience. And while we already started a little bit on some of the things that I don't think work well, let's officially start the part of the video where we discuss some of the problems that I feel like are here. And at the top of that list are these skill tests. I don't care about skill tests. I think they're boring. I think they feel like filler. You land on a space, you draw a card, you discard the right colors from your hand, you roll some dice, and then you try to mitigate, the terrible roll that you may have. Or you're like, wow, I did it. Moving on, that was my turn. There's not a ton of interesting decision-making in skill tests. You might argue that the decision-making is in trying to draft the right cards so that you're never stumped by a skill test. But the skill tests are not, you don't have perfect information about the skill tests. It's not like in combat where, you're gonna know what happens based on the way that the dice roll for a particular monster. That information is never presented to you. You draw blindly off the top of an exploration deck, or you draw blindly from the top of a Void Rift deck. And so with a little bit of resource management or some lucky rolls, you usually can push through, but it rarely feels like a memorable moment. And when you compare that to the combat where sequencing and teamwork and clever mitigation actually make you feel like you did a thing, the skill tests just don't hold up in my opinion. Too many turns end with another flat skill test instead of a fight. And if the design team leaned more heavily into combat and trimmed back some of these checks, I think the whole experience would feel sharper and more exciting, albeit it would probably be a longer game that took more time to table. Just another argument for leaning into that solo mode where you can just focus, and really enjoy your time. I'm going to get into some nitpicky things now. The UI and graphic design of this game, I have no idea at the time of filming this video what the price point of this game is, but it's a miniatures game on Gamefound, so I'm going to assume that it's expensive. And at that expense level, I'm going to want dual layer boards that allow me to track health and resources like Scythe or In Too Many Bones. These problems were solved years ago, and I know that it increased manufacturing costs and likely shipping costs because it's a little heavier, but these problems are things that we shouldn't have to put up with as board gamers. Bumping my character sheet and losing track of my health and my legend points, it just ain't the vibe, okay? There's no reason for it. And additionally, for a game that has this many systems, the interface is just not up to par yet. Organizing all of the little bits and bobs to make gameplay intuitive, or at least more intuitive, seems to be missing at this point. You know, I'm looking for something like the Massive Darkness 2 card rack. So, you know, providing people with a structure for them to be able to interact with something spatially that helps them along through the phases themselves, I think is a really important thing. And the last thing, and maybe one of the most important things that this game has really struggled with that I think they need to do a better job of, is the rulebook is rough. And I think that this is mostly due to localization. It's technically learnable after you reread it a lot and you cross-check a lot, but the rulebook does not feel like a finished product at all, and that really hurts a game with this many systems running all at once. This is exactly the kind of thing that prototypes like this often struggle with, and it's certainly something that, you know, polish and you know, a little bit of work can fix before delivery. So that's it for my review of Spellrift Legends. It's a prototype with some rough edges, but it also has some genuinely exciting ideas, especially the multi-use cards and the combat system. It's fun and replayable, and I think solo players in particular are going to get a lot of value out of this. But what is my final verdict? You know, who is this for? Who is this not for? And I think that this is definitely for you if you enjoy that zombicide dice chucking energy, but you want more complexity, more systems layered on top. Or maybe you're an Eldritch horror fan who wants a new reskin with sort of like a general fantasy theme, you know, instead of just cosmic horror only, then you'll probably feel right at home here. And probably most impressively, honestly, to me at least, if you really want a solo adventure game, this could really work nicely for you. I cannot overstate how enjoyable this game has been for me solo. Who is this not for? This is definitely not for you if you hate dice or if you want, you know, polished narrative out of the core box. If you need something that's quick to teach and play, this is also probably not for you. But I will reiterate, if you really hate dice, don't play this game. It has a lot of dice, and a lot of the systems rely on dice and dice mitigation. Overall, I think Spellrift Legends has a very solid foundation that could grow into a fantastic game with polish. Definitely worth a look when the Gamefound campaign launches on September 16th. It's been a lot of fun for me to play just in the state that it's currently in now, and I expect it to improve with development. But remember, this is crowdfunding, it's not retail, so do your homework before you back, and back it only if it looks right for your table. But hey, I want to hear from you guys. If you've played Dragori's earlier titles like Arena, The Contest, or Tenaris Adventures, let me know in the comments below what you think about Spellrift Legends and how you think that this might compare to those titles. And if you're curious about backing, make sure that you check out the Gamefound campaign page in the description below as well. Additionally, Dragori is hosting a nice giveaway as promotion for Spellrift Legends, in which you could win a copy of Slay the Spire, Massive Darkness 2, The Witcher Old World, and of course Spellrift itself, by providing them your name and email, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Thanks for watching the video. If this was helpful at all, please remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more videos coming. Very likely Zombicide Frozen Fortress Part 2 will be next. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.